Is Ferrari the new frontrunner for the rest of the season and 2025? After an incredibly dominant COTA GP, we've now learned a lot about the very up and down season of the current SF24 Ferrari car and how it's now finally gotten to its prime position in a very dominant fashion in COTA. The car has undergone many changes and plenty of work has been done to fix the balance of the car. How did Ferrari come up with this with no upgrades coming into this GP is one of the biggest things, and we've learned so much, so let's talk about it for this video. No upgrades, it's been talked about so much, but a lot of it has to do with the improvements that were made in Monza in Singapore, which were significant upgrades and have done a bunch for the car to have a more consistent balance for both Carlos and for Charles, because both of them can drive the car. They didn't have to make any compromise coming here into COTA. Every car, with the exception of Williams, did bring upgrades, so they were looking for a better balance, had to go into their system and figure out what was the right setup. Ferrari has now figured it out within the upcoming GPs, and they've been pretty much the fastest for the last couple of them. These cars definitely don't just rely on upgrades, and it's clear to see that the way that you set up the car is the most important, and whether you can be efficient with that setup and the balance is in the correct position. Because right now the times are so marginal that upgrades themselves are only really there to give a better balance on the car and help with oversteer or understeer if you have that inherently going through certain corners. The downforce level they used was a medium downforce rear wing, so the car was pretty much set up as stagnant as it could be, and they weren't compromised anywhere. Sector 1 was super strong, Sector 2 as well, and Sector 3. They weren't necessarily the best in any of those sectors. Red Bull was good in Sector 1, McLaren in Sector 2. I guess Ferrari was close in Sector 3, but it was always a toss-up between McLaren and Ferrari, but they were always right behind those guys and had the best setup throughout the GP in each corner, which tells us a lot about the trajectory in these next upcoming races and what we can expect to see. Now, the track record recently has also been very good, and I'm going to talk from Monza onwards. Zandvoort, as the second half of the season started, was a good GP, but not necessarily their best one. And as these Monza upgrades came, which were supposed to be performance enhancing upgrades, and they have done just that. Baku, they were a front running car with Charles up there. Monza, they won with Charles. Carlos also had a great race. It was also a very good strategy, but it helped that they had the tire wear for it. Singapore, if it wasn't for the mistake, they arguably could have won that GP as well. And in COTA, they were dominant here. And all they brought was that front wing from Singapore, which is definitely something that needs to be talked about specifically, because with this track record and now 2025 upcoming, this wing was brought for them to test on their what is probably going to be an SF25 car, and this is the front wing spec that we are expecting to be used on that car. They've already been developing the 2025 car, and bringing these parts now has just been extra onto their testing for 25, because the championship, while there's a possibility, of course, it's Formula 1, there's always a possibility. This 2024 season for Leclerc and both Carlos is pretty much impossible for them to win. So they're focusing on that 25 car, where the possibility is now much higher, and they already have additional parts on this car that's being tested and are working properly with the flex that they've added, with the way that the front wing is performing and how the flow is going over the car. These are very good signs for a very good Ferrari team as of right now. And Fred Vasseur has definitely stepped up in both the upgrade department, how he wants the team to be communicating. And Leclerc has talked recently about, in general, how working with this new engineer has helped him calm down, and the effective strategy has always been working. So with COTA being that outlier they needed, this was super desperate for them to actually win here and see if the upgrades worked, because as I talked about on the track record, Singapore, it's always been a good track for them. Monza's also been a good track for them. Baku's another one of those tracks. Vegas is another track that's upcoming that should be a very good GP for them. But COTA has been decent, but not exactly what they wanted in the car. So they've proven here that they can actually perform. Last year, they had a pretty good Mexico GP, regardless of that mini turbo that they have. They were able to fix that for Mexico and have improvements coming to be able to help, obviously, with the heat and the altitude in Mexico. Every team brings up cooling, so we should see that on the Ferrari car as well. But as I also stated, Vegas being a good GP upcoming, They have a good time in Abu Dhabi as well. It has those corners that they like. Those are two GPs that we can pretty much almost guarantee they should be fighting at the front right now with the current car and with every team not bringing any more upgrades. And this is the pecking order for the very end of the season. And now on looking to 2025, we'll have to see what happens in the winter. But if we're talking about 2025, we obviously have to talk about Lewis and Charles and that combination of drivers, because it'll be very interesting seeing how these drivers work together and whether the car is going to work for both of them. Now, I obviously have a full-on video on if the car will work for Lewis in 2025. I'd love if you'd go check that out. I think it deserves a little bit more love, so that'd be amazing from you guys. But right now, the current version of the car is working super well for both Carlos and Charles, even though they have complete opposites of driving styles. And I've talked about this before. Carlos loves to have some inherent understeer in the car. He's always liked to drive a bit of a boat, some people might say, while Leclerc loves an aggressive car that he can put completely onto the nose and push very hard with, which is a more oversteery style throughout his career, but it's obviously been very successful. So there's no dominant way of driving this car, and both ways work on saving the tires. You can pick when you want to save them or not. We heard that from both Carlos and Charles. Charles ended up actually saving in the beginning of that sprint, then pushing towards the end. But it looked like Carlos' strategy of pushing in the beginning and then just having whatever is left over at the end worked a little bit better. So the car now has a good compromise on that very nice balance that they have. There is no more issues going through any of the corners. The bouncing seems to have been gone, which was something that definitely would have been looked into 2025, but all those problems are going away. So both Lewis and Charles are in a very good position now to be fighting at the front. This looks like a car that has the least amount of problems, with obviously McLaren being right up there as well. We still have yet to see if those upgrades worked, and they still have some more parts coming. They're one of the only teams that has said so far that upgrades should still be coming to the car, and that will be definitely a question mark above Ferrari and Red Bull's head. But this GP to me has solidified them as a team not to be messed with, and definitely a very solid foundation for 2025, as the base of this SF24 car at the very end of the season is something that can be looked into a lot going into 2025. And both Lewis and Charles should be very happy with what the Ferrari engineers have been able to cook up with this beautiful car. There were also talks of upgrades going into this GP, and we didn't see much of that. There are little minor parts which we could expect on the Ferrari car by the end of the season, and I expect all these to be little things that they can add to their 2025 car and just to test it out. We saw Red Bull do that in 23 for 24, and we're going to continue to see that with teams because 25 is going to be extremely close. And these little parts could just be little aero efficient parts, kind of like that little Cobra wing that they have. Expect similar aero parts added onto the car to just make it that bit more efficient, because they got the front wing, they got pretty much everything else in the car kitted up, and there isn't too much to add with the exception of a big long winter where they can pretty much revise the car and get it perfected, as well as working on the chassis, because we did hear rumors about a certain suspension that could be used in the front. Clearly, doesn't seem like the suspension is hindering them that much. It's more about whether they can get the balance right and setup. With no upgrades, they conquered in Coda. I expect them to do very well in the next upcoming GPs. Mexico could be the outlier, but they worked really well in 23, so I would expect that as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. What are your thoughts on Ferrari? This is a big step up for them. They needed this. This was that outlier track that both Carlos and Leclerc were talking about. And now I fully expect this team to be up top in 25 right off the bat. I don't think we're going to get a Bahrain like we did with Red Bull dominating in that fashion. Tire wear is good. Car is good, balance is good, and now it's really just up to Lewis and Charles to put it in there. 8th or first championship is possible now. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Please leave a like, subscribe, it'd mean the world, and peace.